We're now recording. Hola, cage fighting connoisseurs. This is Kid Native Bloody Elbow, joined by Ryan Harkness of Fightlinker. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me again.
And we are here to talk about Anderson Silva. Some say he's the greatest of all time. What say you, Ryan Harkness? Is
Well,
Anderson Silva the greatest of all time?
you can't argue that he's pound for pound number one right now. Greatest of all time is subjective to what time frame we're talking about. Right now, everybody agrees, but Fedor used to be the greatest of all time. Now he's a bum. So Chuck Liddell used to be up there and people used to rave about him. Now he's this guy who, through a particular set of circumstances and opponents just did really well. And if Anderson Silva loses a fight or two against, say, a wrestler or something like that, people will just say he's exposed. And that fucking label will disappear.
So let's say he loses to Chris Weidman. Is that it? Is that the end of the greatest of all time talk?
If he gets into his next fight and loses the same way, which is a possibility because, let's face it, every time he's fought a guy who wasn't afraid of him and actually wrestled him to the ground, he didn't do very well. Like Travis Lutter had a lot more success than anybody really thought was possible. We came close to having...
Travis Lutter also tapped to strikes.
True, but they were downward elbows in all senses except the legal sense, or the illegal sense, rather. So they weren't exactly like... They weren't pussy strikes, It wasn't like a couple punches to the face or anything.
Dan Henderson, he got him down. He wasn't afraid of him, but he ended up tapping out to a submission in the second round.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, you can't ignore the fact that Anderson Silva, if you're going to take him down and hold him down, is still going to have 5 rounds to... do something about it. So that's always the interesting thing about these kinds of fights, and it's what's going to be interesting about the Weidman fight is, Weidman showed with Mark Munoz that he has some finishing power. I'm still thinking that, that one fight seemed to make everybody a believer, and I'm still not sure. I remember the Demian Maia fight. Yeah, it was on short notice, but still. And, I'm not completely sold on Chris Weidman, the awesome finisher.
So you're picking Silva in this fight?
I think Silva's a pretty safe bet. Weidman is talking a good game and he's making it interesting, which is, what the UFC's been waiting for a while is someone to convince us that they're going to challenge Anderson Silva and actually go toe-to-toe with him and actually fight him. I feel like half the guys who fight Anderson Silva lately, they're half beaten by the time they get into the cage just mentally.
And you don't think Weidman has fallen for that, or you can't tell?
Weidman is crazy or something. Weidman honestly thinks he's going to win. Weidman you've heard him talking. He has complete faith in his abilities. A good thing to have. There's nothing wrong with some optimism and some positive thinking. So
who's an opponent that, when you say they were scared of Anderson Silva, who comes to mind? Who are you thinking of?
Forrest Griffin. Let's see, who else was there? I'm trying to think through. Stephan Bonner put up a good fight.
He was roided to the gills.
He was. I still think with a lot of guys that come in, things seem to hurt them more when they're fighting Anderson Silva. It seems like there's a more physical reaction. It's kind of like you go to the dentist and there's that drill, and maybe the pain in your gums isn't as crazy as, say, like, I don't know, a kick in the nuts or like someone jabbing you with a pen. But just because you're terrified of it and it freaks you out, it's going to feel so much worse, and you're going to react so much worse, and your body is just going to betray you, basically. Which is, I think, what we see to a certain degree is I don't know, it's like a weird alpha dog thing. Like when the alpha dog gets up on you, you just roll over and show your neck.
Who's somebody that wasn't afraid of Anderson Silva? Have we seen anybody get into the cage or ring with him that you felt was fearless in the face of...
Chael Sonnen. He did a pretty good job of being fearless, and it maybe a little bit too fearless that second time with that spinning back fist. So,
well, do you think that those losses were both Sonnen losing more than Silva winning? I mean, Matt Lindland, his former coach, called him second place Sonnen and said he was always going to dig deep and find a way to lose in the big match.
Yeah, the first one definitely, it seemed like he had it in the bag and he just fucked it up. The second one, I don't think he came close enough to winning. I mean, he had a good first round, and the thing about Anderson Silva is that's all it takes is if you have a good round against him, then people are gonna speak praises of your performance for a while. As long as you don't James Irvin or Forrest Griffin yourself in a fight against Anderson Silva, people will typically hold you up. I mean, even Patrick Cote gets accolades for his fight, even though he did nothing other than take a lot of punches to the head and then blow out his knee.
I figured you were going to raise your countryman's name. I mean, I hear in Canada they call Patrick Cote the uncrowned middleweight champ.
I don't know about that. We Canadians, we take our stars where we can get them. You know what I mean? So it's sometimes slim pickings, but Patrick Cote's been around for a while. He's a really nice guy, and Canadians, we're polite. We like our own guys, even if we know that they're never really going to do all that much moving and shaking wise.
So when did you become a believer in Anderson Silva? Did you figure when he was coming over the UFC that he was going to? Did you see this coming, that he was going to go on, put together the longest undefeated streak in UFC history, et cetera, et cetera?
No, absolutely not. It was the Chris Lieben fight obviously put him in everybody's mind, but it was the Rich Franklin fight obviously is when you realize that there's something special going on, and even with. There's the thing that I find about Anderson Silva that's so interesting is his ability to hit you from anywhere. He's got really great pinpoint accuracy, and basically if he wants to hit you and hit you hard, he's going to connect right where he wants to. I like some guys, it seems nowadays in Ultimate Fighting, they're just punching for the head, but Anderson Silva will aim straight for the jaw, or he'll aim straight for the nose, or he'll try to get you right in the teeth, and he always lands where he's trying to hit. And to me, just watching him throwing knees against Rich Franklin, you had the one right up the middle, and then one on the side of the ribs, and then one around the back. I mean, everything that he is an artist, not in between fights. I don't consider that an art form, what he does with Dana White, stringing everything along and being a crazy pain in the ass to deal with. But in the cage, violence is his paintbrush, and whatever he wants to do, he conveys that to the canvas effortlessly.
And so what do you think is his masterpiece? What performance of violence was the most beautiful and brutal exhibition of Anderson Silva's career?
I saw Rich Franklin 2 in Ohio live, and I thought that was great because we got to see Rich Franklin get knocked out twice, because he got basically knocked out at the end of the first round, and his corner dragged him to his side, and he got up for the second round, and he got knocked right back down again. So I thought that was pretty good. I mean, it's been a while. Chael Sonnen challenged him, and but not in a really, he didn't really rise to the occasion until the very end in that one. So I just say, his flat-out beatings, I really like Rich Franklin 2.
Rich Franklin 2 is... What do you think was his worst performance? This is a guy who's been accused of dogging it. His fights with Talis Leites, Demian Maia...
Yeah, all those. There was a year, he had that entire fucking year where he just went through those 3 fights, and he was just... Honestly, it was like he didn't care. He didn't want to be there, and to a certain degree, he had a point where guys weren't fighting him. There was a perception at the time that he was waiting for people to attack him, and then he'd counter-strike them. And so the new strategy that guys had coming in was to wait and make Anderson engage with them instead. And that just ended up with everybody staring at each other, like these 2 guys staring at each other in the cage for several rounds, and everybody just watching the cage booing, and those were just disasters. And for a while, it was interesting because I thought even if he started kicking people's asses again, we wouldn't forget it. But once he kicked Vitor Belfort in the face, we all forgot about all the bullshit, and we're back to being his adoring fans. So.
It does seem that way. It does seem that way. What about his pre-UFC career? What are your favorite moments? Obviously, he had the losses to Chonen, Takasi. What are your highlights and lowlights from Anderson Silva's pre-UFC career? Were you following him closely, or?
Well, here's the interesting thing about it, and this kind of is to me the most interesting thing about Anderson Silva is throughout Pride he was kind of like a non-entity. I mean, I went through when I was going through my real honeymoon with MMA, went through all the old Prides and I watched them all. And Anderson Silva was a fighter that just didn't really stick out. It's the kind of fight where you watch it and then a week later you don't even remember that you saw Anderson Silva fight because it was just kind of, it was there.
He starched Carlos Newton. I mean, that was a thing of beauty.
Yeah, that's true. That's very true. He had his moments, and they were impressive. But it's the same as, say, like if you're watching UFC undercards or prelims, and you see some guy come out and have one really good performance. It was kind of like, God, I'm trying to pull out his name out of my ass right now.
James Krause.
James Krause kind of meets that same criteria where he has one great fight amongst like 4 or 5 kind of mediocre fights, and you raise an eyebrow and you say if he can do that. Igor Papryak, he's not the guy that just fought.
He just
Roy Nelson. Yeah, no. Who's Stipe Miocic?
Yeah, Stipe.
Yeah, there we go. Stipe is a guy who most of his fights, he's practically a non-entity. When he attacks, he does really well, but for the most part, there's nothing really to write home about. And then he had this amazing fight with Roy Nelson. People are saying Stipe's here, Stipe's here. I'm like, you might want to wait a couple more fights and see if he just settles back into not doing anything. So, back in Pride, Anderson was there. There were flashes of brilliance, but I don't think anybody foresaw him completely turning everything around. And to me, he's like if you want to talk to any of these fighters, like there's always that interesting point in a fighter's career where they realize that they're not going to be number one. They're not going to be the champion. All of their aspirations of being at the top of the sport, they're not going to happen. And a lot of guys get depressed. They pull a Rashad Evans and they don't know what they're doing with their career anymore. Anderson Silva was at that point, and he turned it around and became the greatest fighter of, at the moment, all time. So it kind of, to me, it opens it up where you can say, look at anybody. Look at, say, Alan Belcher, who kind of, was a bit up and down earlier on in his career. Rich Clemente in his corner telling him not to kick because I don't know why. But, why play to your strengths? You know what I mean? So he, to a certain point, I thought that he might be able to turn around and do some Anderson Silva stuff. And I'm always interested when I'm watching some of these journeymen as to whether or not they're going to pull an Anderson Silva and just turn it around and just connect the dots and just turn into this unstoppable force.
Well, Silva credits the Nogueira brothers, particularly Antonio Rodrigo, for saving his life, saving his career, convincing him not to quit. What do you make of that story? Do you think, is Big Nog holding out? Could he do this for more fighters? Could Big Nog reach out and save Alan Belcher, or do you have to be Brazilian?
I don't know. I don't know how it works because, sometimes it's not about skill. It's about passion and stuff like that. And this is one of those things that ties into fighter pay and why it pisses me off so much when you hear about, these guys coming into the UFC who can't pay their bills, who are actually practically going into debt to fight, is that when you've got all those pressures piled up on you, how are you supposed to compete at your best? And when you're dealing with that kind of stuff, how can you give your all, and how can you feel positive moving forward on this amazing martial arts quest that you're trying to do? Karate Kid, they never show him fucking poring over bills and trying to figure out how his single mom is paying bills. They show him
washing cars for hours and hours.
Yeah, actually, that's probably not too dissimilar to some of these undercard guys' situations.
Wipe on, wipe off.
So I mean, I've heard the general story about how Nogueira took him in and picked him up emotionally and dusted him off and everything. Was there more to that? Did Nogueira allow him to stay at his house? Did he take care of him financially? Did he take all the burdens off of him so he could concentrate solely on the sport? Was that the difference?
I don't know to what extent he financially helped him out, but I do get the feeling that Chutaboxer was not particularly supportive of Anderson Silva. That Anderson Silva was sort of the redheaded stepchild at Chutaboxer. And Pele Landy Johns will tell you has made some fairly ugly allegations about the Chutaboxer camp, that it had to do with the race of the fighters and that the white fighters were favored over the darker skinned fighters. I don't know enough Portuguese to get into the ins and outs of that, but it definitely seems the Chutabox, along with the Brazilian top team, was one of the camps that was taking a big slice of the pie off the top during the Pride era. And both of those camps, not coincidentally, lost almost all their fighters when Pride ended and the UFC gleefully revealed to the fighters just how big a slice their camps were taking. Because Dana White loves to be between a fighter and his management, if he can. So that was the impression I got, that it had more to do with making Anderson feel like he was a star, that he was a top fighter, that he was worthy of attention and not just another shark to be thrown into the tank, with the cyborgs and the shoguns and the ninjas beating the bejesus out of each other inside Chuda boxing. But I don't know the details of the extent to which they helped him financially or anything, but I do know that after that, then he turned it around, started his Cage Rage career, had the Rumble on the Rock run, and then got signed by the UFC, and the rest is history. So there you go. What about the Nate Marquardt fight? Do you have any memories of that one? That was a special favorite of mine because that was the one Anderson Silva used a wrestling switch to win. That's the guy who's notoriously weak at wrestling, and here he is fighting not a terrible wrestler, not a great wrestler, but a guy who's known for his grappling, and Silva uses a switch on him. Did you see that coming?
Well, Nate Marquardt is another. He's a guy that fits that Chael Sonnen always finds a way to lose type thing. He seems like a guy who's battling himself in the cage just as much as he is anyone else. And if there's an example of a guy who was half beaten by the time he walked in, I think Nate Marquardt probably applies. And when he was on that really great streak recently, he kind of alluded to the fact that his head wasn't in the right place and that he didn't fight the fight that he wanted to, and that he really wanted to get back in there. But of course, he couldn't keep his streak going because Nate Marquardt is Nate Marquardt, and inconsistency is just part of his gig.
So is there anybody Anderson Silva's fought that you feel like would do better if they got a rematch? Like Dan Henderson or Vitor Belfort? Do you think these guys have anything left to offer Anderson Silva? Was there ever a time when Dan Henderson could have given a better performance against Anderson Silva?
I don't know if Dan Henderson can do it because Dan's getting old and he's slowing down and he's just throwing those big haymakers and he tires out. And I think that was kind of what happened in their fight, was that he got a little bit tired and then the tide swept over him and Anderson took over. And as soon as that switch went from Dan pushing forward to Anderson pushing back, that was pretty much the end for him. And I think it would be very similar. But Vitor Belfort, on the other hand, that's a fight that I don't even really feel like we saw. That didn't even really happen. It's kind of like Junior Dos Santos versus Cain Velasquez 1, where it ended in 10 seconds. And it's like, yeah, they can both walk into the middle of the ring and one will knock the other one out off of one shot. That doesn't mean they really fought. It doesn't mean that you saw, if that fight happens 10 times, that's what's going to happen every time. And, Vitor Belfort right now is on a roll. Credit Jesus or whatever.
Or TRT.
Like. Yeah, credit whatever you like to that. But, he's been looking like a beast lately. And I wouldn't... to me, that's the most interesting fight. After Weidman, I think Belfort would be the most interesting fight. Obviously, I'm still holding out for a George St. Pierre or Jon Jones fight. But, I've practically given up on that completely. I'm tired of trying to kick that football.
So let's pretend that we haven't given up on those fights happening. How do you handicap those? Does GSP have any chance against Anderson Silva?
This is probably my inner Canadian secret full of pride and always wanting to one-up the world, just quietly in the background, never boasting that or anything. But I think George St. Pierre would win, and that's what's frustrating about the whole... amazing wrestler with amazing submission defense. He's got all the tools, and he'd have no problem holding Anderson Silva down for 5 rounds, and he wouldn't get caught in a stupid triangle like Chael Sonnen. So I find it very upsetting that fight isn't going to happen. Jon Jones, I don't know. They're both. He'd have to kind of fight Anderson on the feet because I think Anderson takes him on the ground.
Really?
And that's not a recipe for success. Well, I find that the one weakness that we've seen in Jon Jones lately is his submission defense. So
because of the Vitor Belfort armbar, is that?
Yeah, basically. It's one instance, and but you find the chinks in the armor where you can, and you kind of hold on to them, and you say this is where. It's kind of like with Ronda Rousey, because that one chick got her back for 10 seconds, then all of a sudden that's the way. That's the blueprint.
I see. Well, didn't Jones just destroy Chael Sonnen on the ground? Didn't he destroy Brandon Vera on the ground? You don't think he would smash Anderson's orbital bone in a similar fashion?
No. Talking about Brandon Vera and Chael Sonnen, these are different grades of fighters. The interesting thing about Chael Sonnen is that he's always going to go in and try his best. And that's what I always kind of didn't like about, say, Brandon Vera getting put in these situations. There are fights like a Stephan Bonner situation. The reason that people were kind of intrigued in that is because they believed the hype that Stephan Bonner was going to go in and give it his all, and 100%. Brandon Vera, has he given 100% in the cage since, what was it,
2006?
Yeah, 2006, when he was going to be the next big thing, and he was violent and aggressive, and he actually attacked. That Brandon Vera is gone. So can somebody smash Brandon Vera's face in very easily? Sure. Can they do the same to Anderson Silva? I very much doubt it.
Wow. So that's a pretty unconventional pick. You've got Anderson Silva losing to GSP, but beating Jon Jones.
Yeah, probably. I don't think. I think Jon Jones would beat George St. Pierre, even if you kind of in some kind of that fantasy pound for pound world where everybody's kind of the same size. Even then, I still give it to Jon Jones. So, but styles make matchups. George St. Pierre fits very well with Anderson Silva, and he wouldn't be against doing the safe thing, pulling a fire ass, a tri-star, and playing it safe and taking those 5 rounds and just being very happy with being the official winner on that, even if everybody boos the entire fight.
Why do you think GSP wants no part of this fight? Because it seems pretty clear that in the GSP fight that he's the hang-up.
Yeah. I just think, Jon Jones was very candid, and this is why we hate his guts. He basically said, we got a lot of money coming into our pockets because we're champions and because we've got these win streaks, and as soon as you lose all of that. And why risk losing that? What's the point? To me, it drives me nuts because it's like, 50 or all the boxers today. If you said you could fight Muhammad Ali or you could fight Mike Tyson, you probably wouldn't win, but then you could say I fought the greatest. And George St. Pierre always talks about he wants to be, he's a martial artist and he wants to challenge himself. What greater challenge is there than the number 1 pound for pound fighter in the world? He said himself that he wants to be known as the greatest fighter in history. There's a very clear path to doing that, and the fact that he's not taking it, I honestly believe that in his mind he thinks that there's a timeline where it'll happen, but if it doesn't happen in the next 6 to 9, well, not 6 months, in the next year, then I think Anderson's going to go elsewhere. He's going to go up to light heavyweight and fight Jon Jones, or do something else wacky. Maybe he's going to start talking about fighting Frank Mir again, or God knows what's going to happen.
So Anderson Silva is 37 years old. How long does this continue? I mean, how long before he falls, and what's the fall? How do you see the fall of Anderson Silva taking place?
Well, I mean, let's just imagine that Chris Weidman does it, because it's very possible that he does. And at that point, he loses, and the big question is, does he stay in his division? Does he do something weird? Does he want to immediately take back his belt? Does he need to a quick build-up fight beforehand? What does the UFC decide stuff? But, at that point, if Weidman does it, everybody already looked at the Chael Sonnen fight and said, this is obviously what we need to do. But if Weidman actually pulls it off, and, I figure he'd have to have a couple of other little, arrows in his quiver to be able to take out Anderson Silva. Every time you expose one of those openings, it kind of changes the game a little. I mean, once Fedor got beat, I don't believe it was that whole aura of invincibility. That was obviously a part of it, but to a certain degree, other than that, people kind of realized that if you put the pressure on him and you turn it around, and you just make sure you're not caught with those Fedor haymakers, then you've got a decent chance.
So you think that Weidman would pop the Anderson Silva bubble, and then the psychological advantage is suddenly gone? You don't think that Fedor... To me, the Fedor collapse had more to do with his mental attitude, that he lost that feeling of inevitability and that relaxation he had in the cage and became desperate and was trying to force the Fedor haymaker. And Anderson Silva, I think, has had more adversity in his career. He's lost. He's been tapped out the flying heel hook. He's lost by decision. So, I don't know. I have a harder time seeing, unless he's just humiliated by Chris Weidman, which I think is pretty unlikely, I have a hard time seeing him internally breaking. And I don't know. I don't think that he's coasting on his aura maybe as much as you do.
Yeah. I mean, well, I guess the big question is, what's Anderson Silva's... I had a lot of very pointed questions about what the hell was going on in his brain when he was doing that, during that year where he fought Demian Maia and Ladies and Cote and stuff like that. And Did he really want to continue? Was he interested in it? He was talking about boxing Jon Jones and everything like that.
Roy
I mean, you got
Jones.
to. Yeah, sorry, Roy Jones. You got to realize that this guy is one of the best paid martial artists in the world. He's considered the baddest man on the planet now that boxing, what is it, the Klitschko's? No, it's not. It's Anderson Silva, for anybody that knows. What kind of life does that man lead? What kind of distractions are there out there? And where's his mindset? And what happens when all of that changes? He's been on the top for, 7 years.
It seems to me that the Brazilian factor is one we haven't talked about, where he really didn't become a star in Brazil until the Vitor Belfort fight. That was the first fight in the current modern wave of popularity of MMA in Brazil. And Brazil's had a history with MMA. It's had peaks and valleys going back to the 1920s with the Gracies, although there was a TV show in the 60s, so on and so forth. It seems like they're in the middle of a boom in their boom and bust cycle, and that Anderson Silva is the beneficiary of that. He's the guy getting the big sponsorships. He's the guy driving the fancy cars. He's the guy being on the talk shows, and it seems like he's thrived on that to me. That he has. I think it's no coincidence that since he's become a star in Brazil, he has not put on a single shitty performance. And I think there's a pride in how he's seen in his homeland that would prevent him from dogging it like he did in those infamous 3 fights. What do you think of that theory?
I like that theory. I think I definitely agree with that because you don't see a lot of the pitfalls. Junior Dos Santos is a guy I got a big question mark over right now because God knows what's going on after he divorced his wife and is probably having sex with every single hot Brazilian woman.
But he's still being managed by his wife.
God knows how that works.
Yeah, that doesn't strike me as a winning formula. But it seems like Silva's got his domestic situation under control. Although there's we've seen Anderson Silva being photographed with a lot of women that are not his wife. Doesn't seem like that comes back to haunt him, not in any way we've seen. Have you seen the infamous "I fuck on the first date" Anderson Silva photo?
Yeah.
It's a classic. So, what about the Roy Jones scenario? Because, of all the boxers I can think of, he's the one that most resembled Anderson Silva in that it was his incredible reflexes and speed that gave him this advantage. But he started moving up and down in weight, and it's like one too many weight cuts, and suddenly he wasn't fast anymore. I've always thought Silva is somebody who's so fast, and one day he's not going to be so fast. And he's going to go for those lightning quick punches. He's going to go trying to keep his hands low and bobbing his head, and he's going to get clipped, and he's going to get caught, and the laser-like punch won't be there to fire back. I think that's how Anderson Silva falls. I think it's going to be age that gets him father time, and I think it's going to be a quick, irreversible decline once he's lost his reflexes. I don't think it's going to be Chris Weidman. I don't think it's got anything to do with psychological factors. I think it's purely a matter of reflex time.
Well, I mean the way I kind of see it is not so much a reflex issue so much as it is he's got terrible wrestling and he sucks on his back, and I don't know if he's putting in the effort he needs in order to stop a guy like Weidman from getting on top of him, and from there. Again, it's Chael Sonnen almost lay on him to a championship belt. Weird things happen every single time you step into the cage. You roll the dice, and maybe he bobs right into a kick to the face, and he just goes out. And it has nothing to do with his reflex speed, and it has nothing to do with his shitty wrestling. It just has to do with bad luck, because that happens all the time. So, I mean, I guess the bigger question is after he loses, how are people going to react? And where's his legacy from there? Because I brought up Chuck Liddell earlier, and he's a guy who everybody was high on the hog with Chuck Liddell throughout his entire era. He was the best, and no ifs, ands, or buts about it. But once he lost, all of a sudden people got that perspective, and they said, well, he was fighting a lot of wrestlers, and we're kind of tailor made to his style. So once you take that into consideration and then look at all of the losses he had in the later thing, maybe he isn't that great. I mean, today's amazing #1 super champion. I mean, we've seen it how many times through the years with Igor Vovchanchyn. Even Heath Herring at one point was considered this big unstoppable fucking freak of nature. And Brock Lesnar. I remember when Brock Lesnar won like 1 or 2 fights, people were, this is the Brock era, and no one who will even touch his singlet, who will even come close to being able to defeat this God man. So to me, sooner or later it's going to happen. It's just inevitable, whether or not it's this Weidman fight or it's a year from now. I can't imagine him holding on for more than a year. Someone's going to get him, and it's just a matter of just statistical reality.
And you think that's going to happen before the end of 2014? That's your prediction?
Yeah, I think so.
And so, do you think he goes out more like B.J. Penn or more like Fedor? Does he have his ups and downs once he's been exposed as immortal? Come back, get some wins, lose some, or does he just go down and out like Fedor?
I think he might get a bit more aggressive with putting together the super fights. You always hear him and his management talking about they want the big fights, and to a certain degree, the belt has constrained him, sort of, from being able to do some of the things that he wanted to. I mean, there was that mysterious call to Dana White a couple of weeks ago that we never really got any clear idea of what it was about. But I mean, you got to figure, he sees a $30 million payday sitting right in front of him, and you don't think he's going to be phoning the UFC talking about it? If he finally loses the belt and he's no longer constrained to the idea of having to defend it against whatever hack middleweights, the UFC still is trying to put a Michael Bisping Anderson Silva fight together in the UK. They got such a hard on for that they're going to make it happen like Bush Jr. with the Iraq War. I
think they've given up on that one. I think they've given up on their.
They've accepted that. Well, sometimes they give up on fights. I feel like they've given up on George versus Anderson happening, or at the very least, they're going to wait until George says something about it. But if Anderson gets a real bee in his bonnet and decides he's going to actually go down to 170, which he fought at 168 in Japan, and he claims that there isn't this huge change in his frame that he couldn't do it. Maybe it's that point where he actually does some of those wacky things he was talking about. He starts chasing belts. He goes up and he fights a popular heavyweight that isn't one of his Brazilian compatriots. That's where he has like 3 or 4. I don't think he's going to try and recapture his magic in that particular division, because I don't think he really gives that much of a shit about the middleweight belt anymore to begin with. So obviously, I don't know how the rebuilding would work or how the UFC would have to set it up, blah, 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 blah. But I mean, to me, I see if he loses, then he's got like a 3 or 4 fight plan where he just goes out and he fights big money-making fights, and he tries to get he tries to get some Floyd Mayweather money.
So, last question. Where do you put, or actually 2 questions. Where do you put Anderson Silva in the greatest of all time sweepstakes as of now? And where do you expect to put him at the end of 2014 when, as you predict, he's lost a fight?
I put him right after Fedor. Fedor to me is still number 1. As much like for what he did in history, he's like the Babe Ruth of MMA, and he'll always kind of be number 1. Anderson Silva has done some amazing things, but just like you can argue with Fedor that the opposition always hasn't been like top shelf and stellar, you could say the same thing for Anderson Silva or George St. Pierre or anyone else like that. So there's always that argument. But I think that it's not just the competition he's fought, it's the way that he's fought them and the way that he's dispatched them. His legacy, I think, is going to hold on a lot much. Like George St. Pierre, when that ship sinks, fucking all the rats are going to jump off that one, because at that point, oh look, he hasn't finished a guy in 5 years, and he's be boring and blah blah blah. It's going to be a nightmare for George St. Pierre as soon as that turns around. Anderson Silva, I think that just like Fedor, there's always going to be people. It doesn't matter how, even if he clown shoes it through the next like 5 years, and maybe if he Ken Shamrocks it and really drags his name through the mud. But generally, I think overall, there's going to be a hot new flavor of the month. I'm sure if Jon Jones starts, shuts his mouth and just gets in the cage and keeps laying beatings on people, he's gonna be the next guy that people are just saying greatest of all time. But I think Anderson is going to hold on to that second spot for me for the foreseeable future. All
right, I've got one more question. You brought up the Ken Shamrock thing. What are the 3 worst possible things Anderson Silva could do to destroy his reputation? Would it be steroids? Would it be doing a Ken Shamrock and just taking fight after fight long after he's no longer qualified to be in the cage? Something outside the cage? What's the worst thing out there that could really damage Anderson Silva's reputation?
I think he could pull one of those. There was this period of time where the UFC was feeding him fights he didn't want, and he was basically, every time they said, "Well, how about this guy?" He goes, "Well, I would, but my elbow." And I think if he bitches out of some big fight, say, who knows why, but he's an artist after all, so you can't understand artists. Say he bitches out of a Jon Jones or George St. Pierre fight. If finally George says, "I want to fight this guy," and Anderson all of a sudden develops, tennis elbow again, then that could really turn things around and really piss off a lot of people.
All right. Well, thanks very much, Ryan. We'll be putting this together into a view of Anderson Silva's career, and I'll probably post this whole interview on YouTube as well. So thanks again, and we'll have you back soon. And always tell people where we can find you.
Fightlinker.com. It's where I talk shit about fighters and make fart jokes about them.
And on Twitter?
Twitter.com/Fightlinker. I do a little bit of that. Tweet me, and I might tweet back.
All right. Well, we'll have you back on soon. Thanks much.
Thanks for having me.
My pleasure.